In the sun-baked heart of New Mexico territory lies Cedar Creek, a place where desert winds carry whispers of both peace and danger through its weathered buildings. But beneath the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves and the lazy drift of tumbleweeds, a storm is brewing. When Jed Rattler Blackwood and his ruthless gang of bandits descend upon this quiet town, they're about to learn a deadly lesson. The unassuming rancher living on the outskirts isn't just another weather-worn cowboy, for in the shadows of Cedar Creek dwells a man whose very name once made hardened killers tremble. Wyatt "Ghost" Callahan, the legendary gunslinger who disappeared 5 years ago after the bloody massacre at Devil's Canyon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across Cedar Creek's main street, its golden rays catching dust motes that danced in the early light. Shop owners swept their wooden porches, the methodical brushstrokes a rhythm that matched the town's unhurried pulse. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from Mason's bakery, mingling with the earthy aroma of desert sage that grew wild beyond the town's borders. A stagecoach rumbled past, wheels kicking up dust as it carried mail and travelers toward Santa Fe, its passage marking time, like the heartbeat of the frontier. Wyatt Callahan sat astride his dappled gray mare, his worn leather vest and sun-bleached hat making him indistinguishable from any other rancher coming to town for supplies. His eyes, though, those were different. Sharp as a hawk's despite his efforts to keep them downcast, they missed nothing while appearing to see little. The townsfolk called him the quiet rancher from Shadow Rock Ranch, and that's all he'd been to them for the past 3 years. Just another hard-working man trying to scratch out a living from the unforgiving desert soil. The crunch of horse hooves on packed earth drew attention from the few early risers along the street. Old Tom Wilson paused in his rocking chair outside the barber shop, his pipe smoke curling lazily in the morning air as he watched Callahan pass. Everyone knew the rancher kept to himself, but none knew why. Rumors circulated like dust devils, but they never seemed to stick to the quiet man who appeared in town only when necessary. Sheriff Wade Montgomery stood outside his office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt as he watched Callahan ride past. The lawman's weathered face bore the lines of someone who'd seen his share of trouble, but Cedar Creek had been peaceful under his watch. He gave Callahan a respectful nod, one that spoke of an unspoken understanding between men who recognized something familiar in each other's bearing. "Morning, Callahan," Montgomery called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Might want to keep your eyes open on the ride home. Had reports of strange tracks out by Devil's Pass." Wyatt touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, a gesture as spare as his words. His mare's hooves clipped steadily against the hard-packed earth as he guided her toward Clara Hawkins's general store, the wooden steps creaking under his boots as he dismounted. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, announcing his presence to the strong-willed woman who'd run the store since her husband's passing 2 years prior. Clara looked up from her ledger, her keen eyes taking in Callahan's dust-covered appearance. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in her dark hair, testament to years of frontier life. "Been a while since you've come to town," she said, setting aside her pencil. "Ranch, keeping you busy?" "Something like that," Wyatt replied, placing a carefully written list on the counter. His calloused fingers brushed against the smooth wood, a contrast that spoke of a man who knew both refined and rough lives. Clara studied the list, but her mind seemed elsewhere. The usual business-like efficiency in her movements was tinged with something else. Concern, perhaps, or worry. "You've heard the talk, haven't you?" she asked, her voice lowered despite the empty store. "About the trouble over in Maple Springs?" Wyatt's shoulders tensed imperceptibly. "What kind of trouble?" "Bandits," Clara said, her face grim. "Led by a man they call Rattler. They hit the bank there last week, killing 3 people. Word is they're moving west." She paused, watching his reaction. "Sheriff Montgomery's been asking folks to keep their eyes open. They say the gang's growing, picking up every piece of human debris between here and the territory line. Outside, young Billy Reeves led a horse to the water trough, his gangly frame and eager movements marking him as one of the town's stable hands. The boy had a quick mind and quicker eyes, always watching, always learning. He caught sight of Wyatt's mare and paused to admire the well-kept animal, unaware that its owner had once been known for far more than his horsemanship. The town's routine continued around them, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, like the electric feeling before a storm. Doc Sullivan walked briskly toward his clinic, his medical bag swinging at his side. Silas Fletcher's hammer rang out from the blacksmith shop, the steady rhythm occasionally punctuated by the hiss of hot metal meeting water. Reverend Parker crossed the street, nodding to passers-by as he headed toward the small white church that stood as a beacon of hope at the end of town. Wyatt gathered his supplies, his movements deliberate and efficient. As Clara wrapped the last items in brown paper, she hesitated, her hands stilling on the twine. They say Rattler's gang. They don't just rob. They destroy everything in their path. Take over towns completely. The sheriff's been organizing meetings, talking about forming a militia. For a moment, something flickered in Wyatt's eyes, a dangerous gleam that belonged more to legend than a simple rancher. But it was gone so quickly, Clara might have imagined it. He paid for his supplies and headed for the door, pausing only briefly. "Best keep your shotgun loaded, Clara." As he mounted up, Sheriff Montgomery approached, his spurs jingling softly against the packed earth. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the street, stretching toward the mountains that loomed in the distance. "Callahan," he said quietly, "might be coming to a time when Cedar Creek needs every man it can trust." Wyatt looked down at the sheriff, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Might be," he agreed softly, then turned his horse toward home. The sun climbed higher as he rode out of town, its heat beginning to shimmer off the distant rocks. Behind him, Cedar Creek continued its daily rhythm, like a pocket watch counting down to something its people could feel coming but couldn't yet name. Only Wyatt Callahan knew the true weight of what approached. He'd seen it before, lived it, ended it. The grip of his right hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins, where beneath his sleeve a worn leather holster held more than just leather and steel. It held a past he'd tried to bury, and a skill he'd prayed he'd never need to use again. But some prayers, like some pasts, refused to stay buried. The afternoon heat shimmered across Shadow Rock Ranch, as Wyatt Callahan tended to his daily chores. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, mending fences and checking livestock with the kind of attention that spoke of a man who'd found peace in routine. But peace, as he well knew, was often just the mask that trouble wore while waiting. The ranch sat nestled against towering red cliffs that gave the property its name, the modest house and barn dwarfed by nature's architecture. A stream cut through the property, its waters clear and cool even in the desert heat, making the ranch one of the most valuable pieces of land in the territory. Not that Wyatt had chosen it for its worth. He'd chosen it for its isolation, and for the clear view it provided of anyone approaching from any direction. As he worked, his mind wandered to memories he'd rather forget. Devil's Canyon. The name alone brought back the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the dying. 5 years ago, he'd been a different man, Wyatt "Ghost" Callahan, the lawman whose name was whispered around campfires from Texas to California. They'd called him Ghost because of how he could appear from nowhere, his guns dealing justice with a speed that seemed supernatural. But that was before the massacre, before he'd watched good men die because he'd trusted the wrong person. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled him from his dark thoughts. Billy Reeves, the stable boy from town, came riding hard up the trail, his young face flushed with exertion. Wyatt's hand instinctively moved toward his hip before he caught himself, old habits dying hard. "Mr. Callahan," Billy called out, reining his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Sheriff Montgomery sent me. There's been trouble over at Watson Place." Wyatt set down his tools, his movements deliberately calm despite the urgency in the boy's voice. "What kind of trouble?" "Riders came through last night. Billy said, still catching his breath. 3 of them. Shot up the place, stole their horses. Old man Watson tried to stop them. They beat him pretty bad. Doc Sullivan's with him now. Wyatt's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The Watson Ranch lay just 10 miles east of Cedar Creek, too close for comfort. "These riders," he said carefully, "did anyone get a good look at them?" Billy nodded eagerly. "Mrs. Watson said one of them had a snake tattooed on his neck. Sheriff thinks they might be scouts for Rattler's gang, testing our defenses." The mention of the snake tattoo made Wyatt's blood run cold. He remembered another man with a similar marking, one who'd ridden with the gang at Devil's Canyon. Not a coincidence. Couldn't be. "Tell the sheriff I'll be in town before sundown," Wyatt said, already turning toward his barn. Billy hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but something in Wyatt's expression made him think better of it. The boy wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Inside the barn, Wyatt moved to a back stall that appeared empty at first glance. But beneath the fresh hay lay a trapdoor, its existence known only to him. He lifted it carefully, revealing a cedar chest that hadn't seen daylight in years. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, not from fear but from the weight of what its contents represented. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a pair of custom Colt revolvers with pearl handles, their blued steel still gleaming despite years of disuse. A gun belt made of the finest leather, the holsters positioned for the lightning-fast cross-draw that had made him famous. And beneath these, wrapped in oilcloth, a badge that still carried a dark stain at its center. A reminder of why he'd walked away. From the house, he retrieved a small journal hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Its pages contained names, dates, and details of every member of the gang he'd hunted before Devil's Canyon. He'd kept it, telling himself it was just in case, but deep down, knowing that someday the past would find him again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As he saddled his mare for the ride to town, a cool wind picked up from the east, carrying with it the promise of change. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the cliffs behind his ranch in shades of blood red. In the distance, a lone coyote called out, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the turning point he now faced. He didn't put on the gun belt, not yet, but he did slide one of the Colts into his saddle holster, covering it with his duster. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, like greeting an old friend you'd hoped never to see again. The ride into Cedar Creek gave him time to think, to plan. If Rattler's gang was indeed moving west, they'd need more than just the sheriff and a few townspeople with rifles. They'd need someone who knew how these men thought, how they operated, someone who'd faced them before. As he approached town, he could see unusual activity despite the late hour. Lights burned in windows that normally would have been dark, and clusters of people gathered on street corners, their voices hushed but urgent. Fear had come to Cedar Creek, riding ahead of the violence that would surely follow. Sheriff Montgomery was waiting outside his office, his face grim in the fading light. Next to him stood Clara Hawkins, her shotgun held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. They both watched Wyatt approach, and in their eyes he could see they knew. The quiet rancher who'd lived among them was about to show his true colors. The time for hiding was over. Ghost Callahan was about to ride again. The town hall meeting that evening drew every soul in Cedar Creek. Lamplight spilled from the windows of the cramped building as concerned citizens packed the wooden benches, their voices a low murmur of worry and speculation. The attack on the Watson Ranch had shattered their sense of security, bringing home the reality of the threat that loomed on their horizon. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in fierce shades of orange and purple, as if nature itself was reflecting the tension building in the town. Sheriff Wade Montgomery stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. His silver badge caught the lamplight, throwing occasional flashes across the worried faces before him. Beside him, Clara Hawkins sat with a ledger open before her, ready to record the proceedings. Her fingers drummed a nervous rhythm on the wooden table. though her face remained composed. Wyatt Callahan chose to stand at the back near the door, his eyes constantly scanning both the room and the darkness beyond the windows. "Most of you have heard about what happened at the Watson place," Montgomery began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "What you might not know is that this isn't an isolated incident. We've had reports from 3 other towns in the territory, all hit by Rattler's gang, all within the past month. Millbrook, Stone Ridge, and Fort Carson, all good towns, all fallen to these animals." The crowd stirred uneasily. Several women clutched their shawls tighter, while men shifted in their seats, hands instinctively moving closer to their weapons. Reverend Parker stood up, his normally gentle face creased with concern. "How many in this gang, Sheriff?" "Started with maybe 15 men," Montgomery replied, his hand resting instinctively on his gun belt. "But they're growing. Every town they take, they pick up more. Outlaws, drifters, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from causing chaos. Last count puts them at nearly 40 strong." From his position, Wyatt watched the fear spread through the room like ripples in a pond. He recognized the tactics. He'd seen them before. Hit the outlying ranches first, test the town's response, then strike when fear has done half the work for you. Through the window, he caught glimpses of younger children playing in the street, blissfully unaware of the darkness gathering around their home. "What can we do?" Silas Fletcher asked. The blacksmith's massive arms crossed over his chest. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his weathered face. "We're not soldiers, Sheriff. Most of us haven't fired a gun at anything more dangerous than coyotes." "No, we're not soldiers," Montgomery agreed, pacing slowly across the creaking floorboards. "But we're all this town's got. I'm proposing we form a militia. Every able-bodied man who can shoot straight and follow orders. We'll set up watches, train together, and prepare ourselves. Better to be ready and not need it than the other way around." Clara stood up, smoothing her skirts as she addressed the crowd. Her voice carried the same strength that had helped her survive as a widow in this unforgiving land. "The general store can serve as a supply depot. I've already started taking inventory of ammunition and necessary provisions. We've got enough to arm 30 men, maybe more if we're careful with our resources." Young Billy Reeves, sitting near the front with the other stable hands, raised his hand nervously. His hat twisted in his hands as he spoke. "I can ride messages between the outlying ranches, Sheriff. No one knows the back trails better than us stable boys. We can warn people if we spot anything suspicious." Montgomery nodded approvingly. "That's good thinking, Billy. We'll need every pair of eyes and ears we can get. There's not a trail or hideout in this territory you boys don't know about." As the meeting continued, Wyatt's mind worked through the strategic implications. The town had natural advantages: high ground to the north, the creek providing water, several defensible buildings. But they also had weaknesses that Rattler's gang would surely exploit. The livery stable was too exposed, the water tower vulnerable. They'd need to address those issues quickly. What about the families? Emma Montgomery, the sheriff's wife, spoke up from her seat near the front. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back severely, her face lined with worry. "If these men are as brutal as we've heard, we can't just leave our children exposed." "The church basement can serve as a shelter," Reverend Parker offered, rising again. His collar seemed unusually tight as he spoke. "It's solid stone, plenty of room, and we can stock it with supplies. The walls are thick enough to stop bullets, and there's a well-access point inside." Doc Sullivan cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "I'll begin preparing medical supplies. Clara, I'll need help gathering what we can from surrounding towns while the routes are still clear. And we'll need volunteers to learn basic medical care. We can't afford to have just one healer if things go bad." The planning continued, but Wyatt noticed something that others missed: the subtle signs of division. Some wanted to fight, others to flee. A few suggested trying to negotiate, not understanding that men like Rattler didn't make deals they intended to keep. He saw it in the way people clustered together, in the sidelong glances and whispered conversations. Finally, Montgomery turned to address the elephant in the room. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he moved to the center of the gathering. "There's one more thing. We need someone with experience. Someone who knows how these kinds of men think and fight. Someone who's faced down evil before and lived to tell about it. All eyes turned to Wyatt. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft crackle of oil lamps and the distant cry of a coyote. He felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions. How much did they know? How much had they guessed? The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, as if responding to the tension in the air. "Mr. Callahan," Montgomery said carefully, "you've been quiet all evening. Got any thoughts to share?" Wyatt stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. The crowd parted before him like water, faces turning to watch his approach. When he spoke, his voice was low, but carried to every corner of the room. Years of command evident in his tone. "Rattler's men will come at night first, testing our defenses, looking for weak spots. They'll hit the outlying ranches, trying to draw us out. When that doesn't work, they'll come in force." He paused, letting the words sink in. The lamplight cast harsh shadows across his face as he continued. "You want to survive this? You need to decide right now if you're willing to fight for this town. Not just talk about it. Fight for it. Kill it if necessary." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of experience. Clara watched him with newfound understanding, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Sheriff Montgomery's hand had never left his gun belt, his fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the leather. "I'll help train anyone willing to learn," Wyatt continued, his eyes meeting those of each person in turn. "But understand this. There's no halfway. Either we stand together, or we might as well pack up and leave now. These men won't show mercy, so don't expect any." The silence that followed was profound. Then Silas Fletcher stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "I'm in." Others followed. Doc Sullivan, his medical bag clutched tightly. Billy Reeves, young face set with determination. Even Reverend Parker, who quietly nodded his assent. One by one, the town made its choice, unity forged in the crucible of fear and resolve. As the meeting broke up, people filling out into the night with renewed purpose, Sheriff Montgomery approached Wyatt. The two men stood in the pool of light from a nearby lamp, their shadows stretching long across the empty room. "You've done this before," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Wyatt met his gaze. "A lifetime ago. And now?" "Now," Wyatt replied, looking out at the darkened street where townspeople hurried home in groups. "We prepare for war." The night wind picked up, carrying with it the first cool breath of autumn. But for Cedar Creek, winter wasn't the season they feared. The real cold would come with the sound of hoofbeats and the glint of gunmetal in the sun. As Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, his hand brushed unconsciously against his hidden holster. Tomorrow, training will begin. Tonight, the town would sleep uneasily, knowing that somewhere out there, riders were coming. And this time, Ghost Callahan would be waiting for them. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek with the sharp crack of gunfire. In the field behind Silas Fletcher's blacksmith shop, Wyatt Callahan stood before a line of townsmen, watching as they attempted to hit targets he had set up at varying distances. The morning air was crisp, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic ping of bullets finding, or more often missing, their marks. "You're anticipating the recoil," Wyatt said, moving down the line with measured steps. He stopped behind Tom Wilson, the barber whose hands were steady with a razor but shook with his borrowed rifle. "Don't fight it. Let it come naturally, like breathing." His voice carried the weight of experience, each word measured and precise. Sheriff Montgomery stood to the side, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a critical eye. The town had managed to gather 28 men for the militia, ranging from young Billy Reeves to old Pete Masters, who'd fought in the war between the states. Some showed promise. Others made Montgomery wonder if they'd be better off manning the shelter than holding a gun. "Again," Wyatt commanded, and another volley of shots rang out. This time Tom's bullet found its mark, splintering the wooden target. A small victory, but in the days to come, such improvements might mean the difference between life and death. Clara Hawkins approached from the direction of town, her boots kicking up dust as she walked. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, but Wyatt noticed the revolver holstered at her hip, new by the look of the leather. "Brought some food for the men," she announced, setting the basket down on a nearby stump. "And news. Billy just rode in from his morning patrol. Says he spotted fresh tracks out by Devil's Pass, at least 6 horses, heading west." Wyatt and Montgomery exchanged glances. Devil's Pass lay east of town, a narrow canyon that served as one of the few routes through the rocky terrain. "Scouts?" Montgomery asked. "More likely a raiding party," Wyatt replied, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "Testing our response time, seeing if we're organized." He turned back to the line of men who had paused in their practice. "Take 5 minutes, get some water, then we move on to moving targets." As the men dispersed toward Clara's basket, Wyatt pulled Montgomery and Clara aside. "We need to accelerate the preparations. Rattler's moving faster than I expected." "The church basement is almost ready," Clara reported. "Reverend Parker and the women have been stocking it with supplies. Doc Sullivan set up a proper medical station down there, too." Montgomery nodded. "Silas has been working day and night, reinforcing doors and windows. But we're short on ammunition, Wyatt. Even with what Clara had in stock, we can't afford to waste bullets on practice much longer." "Then we'll make every shot count," Wyatt said firmly. He glanced at the men who were now gathering around Clara's basket, some laughing nervously at a joke someone had made. "They're learning, but too slowly. We need—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut him off. Everyone's heads turned toward the road, hands instinctively moving toward weapons. But it was only Ruth Coleman riding hard on her bay mare. She reined up in a cloud of dust, her face flushed with exertion. "Raiders!" she called out, dismounting quickly. "At the Henderson place, 3 men, they're burning the barn." Wyatt was already moving. "Mount up," he shouted to the men. "Anyone with a horse, ride now." The rest, get back to town, prepare for trouble. The response was immediate but chaotic. Some men ran for their horses, others stood frozen, unsure what to do. Montgomery began barking orders, organizing those who remained into defensive positions. "Billy," Wyatt called out to the young stable hand. "Ride to Shadow Rock Ranch. Bring my mare as fast as you can." The boy nodded and took off running toward the stables. Clara stepped forward, checking her revolver with practiced ease. "I'll get the women and children to the church," she said. "We've drilled for this." Wyatt caught her arm as she turned to go. "Be careful. This could be a diversion." She met his eyes steadily. "Always am." Within minutes, a group of riders had assembled. Wyatt took stock of them quickly. 8 men, including Montgomery, all armed but only half looking like they knew which end of the gun to hold. It would have to do. "Stay together," he instructed as they prepared to ride. "Don't chase if they run, it could be a trap, and remember—" He paused, making sure he had their attention. "These men won't hesitate to kill you. Don't give them the chance." Billy returned with Wyatt's mare, the animal's coat dark with sweat from the fast ride. As Wyatt mounted up, he saw something in the distance that made his blood run cold. A column of black smoke rising above the trees in the direction of Henderson Place. "Move out," he commanded, and the group spurred their horses forward, hooves thundering against the packed earth. As they rode, Wyatt's mind was already racing ahead, analyzing possibilities. The timing was too perfect, raiders hitting just as they'd begun training. Someone had been watching them, reporting back to Rattler. The wind carried the smell of smoke and the distant sound of gunfire. Behind them, Cedar Creek prepared for trouble, women hurrying children indoors, men taking up defensive positions on rooftops and behind hastily erected barriers. The real war for Cedar Creek was about to begin, and as Wyatt led his inexperienced band of defenders toward the danger, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what Rattler wanted. The game had begun, and the first moves were being played out across the blood-red landscape of the New Mexico territory. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek with a sharp crack of gunfire. In the field behind Silas Fletcher's blacksmith shop, Wyatt Callahan stood before a line of townsmen, watching as they attempted to hit targets he'd set up at varying distances. The morning air was crisp, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic ping of bullets finding, or more often missing, their marks. The sun cast long shadows across the practice field, painting the scene in stark contrasts of light and shadow. "Yeah, you're anticipating the recoil," Wyatt said, moving down the line with measured steps. His boots crunched on the frost-covered grass as he made his way between the men. He stopped behind Tom Wilson, the barber whose hands were steady with a razor but shook with his borrowed rifle. "Don't fight it. Let it come naturally, like breathing." His voice carried the weight of experience, each word measured and precise. "The gun's part of you, not your enemy." Sheriff Montgomery stood to the side, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a critical eye. His badge caught the morning light, throwing occasional flashes across the field. The town had managed to gather 28 men for the militia, ranging from young Billy Reeves to old Pete Masters, who'd fought in the war between the states. Some showed promise. Others made Montgomery wonder if they'd be better off manning the shelter than holding a gun. His own deputy, young James Cooper, showed particular aptitude, his shots consistently finding their marks. "Again," Wyatt commanded, and another volley of shots rang out. This time Tom's bullet found its mark, splintering the wooden target. A small victory, but in the days to come, such improvements might mean the difference between life and death. The other men cheered softly, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Clara Hawkins approached from the direction of town, her boots kicking up dust as she walked. The hem of her practical skirt was already dusty from her morning rounds, and she carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. But Wyatt noticed the revolver holstered at her hip, new by the look of the leather, with a pearl handle that caught the sunlight. "Brought some food for the men," she announced, setting the basket down on a nearby stump. The aroma of fresh biscuits and coffee wafted across the field. "And news. Billy just rode in from his morning patrol. Says he spotted fresh tracks out by Devil's Pass. At least 6 horses, heading west. Found some cigarette butts too, still fresh." Wyatt and Montgomery exchanged glances. Devil's Pass lay east of town, a narrow canyon that served as one of the few routes through the rocky terrain. The high walls and twisting path made it perfect for ambushes. "Scouts?" Montgomery asked, his hand unconsciously moving to his gun belt. "More likely a raiding party," Wyatt replied, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "Testing our response time. Seeing if we're organized." He studied the distant cliffs thoughtfully. "They'll be watching, counting our numbers, noting who can shoot and who can't." He turned back to the line of men who had paused in their practice. "Take 5 minutes, get some water, then we move on to moving targets." As the men dispersed toward Clara's basket, Wyatt pulled Montgomery and Clara aside, moving behind Silas's woodpile where they wouldn't be overheard. "We need to accelerate the preparations. Rattler's moving faster than I expected. He's got experience taking towns. He won't give us the luxury of time." "The church basement is almost ready," Clara reported, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Reverend Parker and the women have been stocking it with supplies. Doc Sullivan's set up a proper medical station down there, too. Got enough bandages and medicine to last a month if we're careful." The Henderson place came into view as they crested the last rise, the black smoke from the burning barn rolling thick against the morning sky. Wyatt raised his hand, signaling the riders behind him to halt. The scene before them told a story his experienced eyes could read all too well. Fresh hoofprints in the muddy yard, the barn door hanging off its hinges, and, most telling, the unnatural silence that hung over the homestead. "Henderson's got a wife and 2 daughters, Montgomery said quietly, drawing up beside Wyatt. "God help us if we're too late." Wyatt studied the property with the calculated precision that had once made him legendary. The main house seemed intact, its windows dark but unbroken. 3 horses were tied up near the burning barn, their riders nowhere in sight. A chicken coop lay overturned, its occupants scattered and clicking in panic. "Silas, Tom, circle around back," Wyatt commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rest of you spread out, 2 men to a position. Don't fire unless fired upon. He turned to Billy Reeves, who sat nervously on his horse. Billy, ride back to town. Tell Clara to send Doc Sullivan out here, but not until we signal it's clear. As the men moved into position, Wyatt dismounted silently, his boots finding the soft earth without a sound. He drew one of his Colts, the pearl handle cool against his palm. Montgomery followed suit, his own movements less graceful but determined. A woman's scream shattered the morning quiet, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Wyatt's reaction was instant. He was moving before the others could even process the sound, his form seeming to flow from shadow to shadow as he approached the house. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. From inside came the sound of rough laughter and another crash. Wyatt pressed himself against the wall beside the door, listening. 3 distinct voices, matching the number of horses, 1 near the front room, 2 deeper in the house. Montgomery had taken position on the other side of the door, his revolver held ready. Wyatt caught his eye and gesture. 3 fingers, then pointed to different areas of the house. The sheriff nodded in understanding. Check the cellar, a gruff voice called from inside. Old man probably got a fortune stashed down there somewhere. Already did, another voice answered. Nothing but vegetables and dust. Wyatt moved like a ghost, slipping through the doorway in complete silence. The first raider stood with his back turned, rifling through a cabinet in the front room. His gun belt lay carelessly on a nearby chair, a fatal mistake. Before the man could turn, Wyatt's gun barrel pressed against the base of his skull. Don't, Wyatt whispered. The raider froze, his hands rising slowly. A floorboard creaked upstairs, followed by more frightened crying. Montgomery entered behind Wyatt, moving toward the stairs with his gun trained upward. The second raider appeared at the top of the steps, dragging Mrs. Henderson by the arm. Time seemed to slow as the raider spotted them. He yanked Mrs. Henderson in front of him as a shield, his pistol pressing against her temple. Drop your guns, or the woman dies, he snarled. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Creek for years to come. Wyatt moved with impossible speed, his left hand drawing his second Colt even as his right hand dealt with the first raider. 2 shots rang out almost as one, the first dropping the raider Wyatt held at gunpoint, the second taking the man on the stairs high in the shoulder. Mrs. Henderson was falling before her captor's grip had even loosened, Wyatt's precise shot having threaded the narrow gap beside her head. The third raider burst from one of the bedrooms, firing wildly. Montgomery returned fire, forcing him back into cover. Mrs. Henderson scrambled down the stairs as Wyatt advanced, his movements fluid and precise. The raider fired again, the bullet splintering the doorframe where Wyatt's head had been a split second before. You've got one chance, Wyatt called out, his voice carrying that same deadly calm. Throw out your gun and walk out alive. Go to hell, the raider shouted back, followed by another wild shot. Already been, Wyatt replied softly. Then he did something that made Montgomery's blood run cold. He stepped directly into the doorway, both guns at his sides. The raider rose to fire, but Wyatt's guns seemed to materialize and bark fire in the same instant. The man's shot went wild as he fell, his gun clattering to the floor unfired. Outside, Silas and Tom had secured the perimeter. The Henderson girls were found locked in the root cellar, scared but unharmed. Old man Henderson himself was discovered in the barn, badly beaten but alive. As Doc Sullivan's wagon approached from town, Wyatt stood on the porch, watching the last flames of the barn fire die down. Montgomery joined him, holstering his gun. That wasn't just skill back there, he said quietly. That was something else entirely. Wyatt's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. They were sloppy, overconfident. He paused, then added, Rattler's men are better trained. These were just disposable scouts sent to test us. And what will they report back? That Cedar Creek is defended, Wyatt replied, but also that we've shown our hand. Rattler will know now what he's up against. He turned to Montgomery, his face grim. That's why he sent them. He wanted to know if the rumors were true, if Ghost Callahan was really here. As if to emphasize his words, a cold wind swept across the yard, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The real war for Cedar Creek hadn't even begun yet, but the opening moves had been made. Somewhere out there, Rattler was waiting, planning, gathering his forces, and now he knew exactly who stood in his way. Word of the fight at the Henderson place spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire. By sunset, every man, woman, and child had heard how Wyatt Callahan had taken down 3 raiders with supernatural speed and precision. The story grew with each telling. Some said he'd shot the guns right out of their hands. Others swore he'd moved like a ghost through solid walls. But the truth, as Wyatt knew, was far more dangerous than any tale. The reality of what was coming would make those stories seem like children's games. In the sheriff's office, Wyatt stood before the 3 bodies laid out on rough wooden tables. The room smelled of death and carbolic acid, the latter from Doc Sullivan's futile attempts to clean the wounds, though no amount of bandages could hide the deadly accuracy of the shots. The evening sun slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the dead men's faces, their features frozen in their final moments of surprise. Montgomery locked the door behind them, the heavy click of the mechanism ensuring privacy for what needed to be discussed. "This one's interesting," Wyatt said, pulling back the sheet from the first raider. His weathered hands moved with the same precise control that had dealt death hours earlier. He pointed to a crude tattoo on the man's forearm, a coiled snake wrapped around a dagger, the ink still slightly raised on the skin. "Rattler's personal mark, but it's fresh, barely healed. These men weren't with him at Devil's Canyon." "New recruits?" Montgomery asked, lighting a lamp as the evening shadows lengthened. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the dead men seem to move in their eternal sleep. "Cannon fodder," Wyatt replied grimly, replacing the sheet with careful precision. "Rattler's building an army, but he's keeping his veteran fighters in reserve. These men were expendable, sent to draw us out, make us show our strengths and weaknesses. He's always been willing to sacrifice pawns to see how his opponent plays the game." Clara entered through the back door, her skirts rustling softly against the wooden floorboards. She carried coffee and a worried expression, the steam from the pot curling in the cooling air. "Found these in their saddlebags," she said, placing several folded papers on the desk. Maps of the area, with marks around all the outlying ranches. And this. She unfolded a larger document, a detailed sketch of Cedar Creek's layout, including notes about defensive positions and water sources. The paper was high quality, the kind used by military surveyors. Wyatt studied the papers, his expression darkening with each detail he absorbed. "They've been watching us for weeks, every ranch, every trail, every possible approach." His finger traced several X marks around the town's perimeter. "These are sniper positions. Rattler's planning something big, something he's been orchestrating since before the Henderson raid." "The whole thing at the Henderson place," Montgomery said slowly, realization dawning in his eyes. "It wasn't just a raid, was it?" "No," Wyatt confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "It was reconnaissance. They wanted to see how fast we'd respond, how many men we could field, what kind of firearms we had." He paused, running his finger along one of the marked trails. "But mostly, they wanted to confirm I was here." Clara poured coffee into tin cups, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. The rich aroma seemed out of place among the smell of death and gun oil. "How do you know Rattler so well?" she asked, passing a cup to Wyatt. "What really happened at Devil's Canyon?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if seeing something in its dark depths. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds that had never fully healed. 5 years ago, I was leading a task force across the territory. We'd been hunting Rattler's gang for months, following a trail of burned towns and murdered families. Finally tracked them to Devil's Canyon. He moved to the window, watching as the last light faded from the sky. A cold wind rattled the glass panes, carrying with it the smell of approaching rain. "I had 30 good men, all experienced lawmen. We thought we had them trapped in the canyon. What we didn't know was that Rattler had a man on the inside, my own deputy, bought and paid for. He gave away our position, our numbers, everything." Montgomery and Claire exchanged glances but remained silent, sensing the importance of what was being revealed. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance across Wyatt's face as he continued. "They hit us at dawn," he said, his voice distant with memory. "Caught us in a crossfire. 23 good men died in the first 5 minutes. The rest?" He trailed off, his hand unconsciously moving to a spot on his chest where an old wound lay hidden. "I got 8 of them before they brought me down. Should have died there, but something wouldn't let me. When I recovered, I walked away from the badge, tried to leave it all behind." "But it followed you here," Clara said softly, her voice full of understanding. "It was always going to," Wyatt replied, turning back to face them. "Men like Rattler, they don't forget. And they don't leave threats alive." The commotion outside drew their attention. Boots thundered on the wooden sidewalk before Billy Reeves came bursting through the door, his young face pale in the lamplight. "Riders coming," he gasped, bracing himself against the doorframe. "From the east, lots of them." They rushed outside, joining the gathering crowd in the street. In the distance, the thunder of hooves rolled like approaching storm clouds. Wyatt's enhanced senses picked out details others missed. The rhythmic pattern of well-trained horses, the subtle jingle of military-grade tack, the measured pace of men who knew their business. "These aren't raiders," he said, his voice carrying to those nearby. "This is the main force, Rattler's veterans." "How many?" Montgomery asked, already moving to organize the townspeople. 30, maybe more. All experienced fighters." Wyatt turned to Clara. "Get everyone to the church, now." She nodded, already moving to help coordinate the evacuation. The street erupted into controlled chaos as people hurried to their assigned positions. Months of drilling and preparation were about to be tested against the cold reality of violence. "They're coming straight up Main Street," Wyatt observed, noting the approaching dust cloud. "Rattler wants a show of force. He's done with testing. This is the real attack." Montgomery dispatched runners to alert the outlying defensive positions. Men with rifles appeared on rooftops taking up prearranged sniper posts. The metallic sound of weapons being loaded echoed through the gathering darkness like the rattling of death's own chains. "Time for everyone to see why they called you Ghost," Montgomery said, checking his ammunition. Wyatt's reply was cut short by a sound that made his blood run cold, a high, piercing whistle cutting through the evening air. He knew that signal. Had heard it before, at Devil's Canyon moments before the massacre began. "Get down," he shouted, just as the first volley of arrows trailing burning oil rags arced over the buildings. The real battle for Cedar Creek was about to begin, and this time, Ghost Callahan would make sure Rattler's reign of terror ended for good. Burning arrows rained down on Cedar Creek, their fiery trails cutting through the gathering darkness like falling stars. The town erupted into controlled chaos as people scrambled for cover. Wyatt's warning had come just in time. The deadly missiles found only empty streets and prepared positions where water barrels stood ready. "Return fire!" Montgomery shouted from his position behind a reinforced barricade. Rifles cracked from the rooftops as the town's defenders engaged the unseen attackers. Through the smoke and chaos, Wyatt's trained eye spotted movement in the tree line, shadows detaching themselves from deeper shadows. "They're splitting up," he called out, his voice carrying over the din. "Watch the alleys. They'll try to flank us." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, reloading his Colt even as he spoke. The pearl handles gleamed dully in the firelight like bones in moonlight. Clara organized a bucket line from the water tower, her voice sharp and clear as she directed the townspeople. Women and children who couldn't fight passed, buckets with grim determination dousing flames before they could spread. The air filled with steam and smoke, creating an eerie fog that drifted through the street. The first wave of Rattler's men charged up Main Street, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth. These weren't the raw recruits from the Henderson place. These were veteran killers, their guns blazing with deadly accuracy. 2 defenders fell from the rooftops, their rifles clattering to the street below. Wyatt moved like a spirit through the chaos, his guns speaking with terrible precision. 3 riders fell before they could register his presence, their shots going wild. A 4th managed to level his rifle at Wyatt, only to find himself staring at empty air as the legendary gunslinger seemed to vanish and reappear 2 steps to the left. "Silas!" Wyatt shouted. "The livery!" The blacksmith turned just in time to see shadows moving near the stable doors. His shotgun roared, and two of Rattler's men fell back, cursing. But more were coming, using the confusion of the main attack as cover. Young Billy Reeves proved his worth, spotting a group trying to circle behind the church. "Mr. Callahan," he called out, his voice cracking with excitement and fear. "By the cemetery!" Wyatt spun, his coat flaring out like dark wings. 5 riders had indeed made it to the cemetery, using the tombstones as cover while they prepared to hit the town's flank. Time seemed to slow as Wyatt's arms moved in that deadly dance he'd hoped never to perform again. Both Colts thundered, the sounds merging into one continuous roar. 4 riders fell. The 5th's horse reared, throwing its rider before bolting into the darkness. The fallen man scrambled for cover behind a marble angel, his rifle searching for a target that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Wyatt's bullet found him before he could pull the trigger. "They're falling back," someone shouted. Indeed, the main force was retreating, leaving their dead and wounded behind. But Wyatt knew better than to take it as victory. "Get ready," he warned, reloading with mechanical precision. This was just the first wave. Montgomery joined him, blood trickling from a graze on his cheek. "How many did we lose?" "3 confirmed," Clara reported, emerging from checking the fallen. "6 wounded, but Doc Sullivan says they'll live." She carried her shotgun with the ease of someone who'd found her strength in desperate times. A high, cruel laugh cut through the momentary quiet. A rider had appeared at the far end of the street, sitting tall in his saddle. Even at this distance, Wyatt would know that silhouette anywhere. Jed Rattler Blackwood himself came to oversee the destruction of Cedar Creek. Ghost Callahan, Rattler's voice carried easily, filled with mock friendship. "Still quick as ever, I see. Devil's Canyon didn't slow you down." Wyatt stepped into the street, ignoring Montgomery's attempt to pull him back. "It's over, Rattler. You've lost your best men already." Another laugh, this one colder. "Lost them, brother? I've just been measuring you up, seeing if the legend still lives." He raised his arm, and more riders appeared behind him, at least 20 strong. Now the real dance begins. A bottle arced through the air, trailing flame, the first of many. Molotov cocktails crashed against buildings and barricades, spreading liquid fire. More arrows followed, these carrying something new, bags that burst on impact, spreading burning oil in wide patterns. "Fall back to secondary positions," Wyatt commanded. The defenders retreated in good order, just as they'd drilled, but Rattler's men pressed forward, using the flames as cover. The night erupted into a storm of gunfire and burning chaos. Through it all, Wyatt moved like a vengeful spirit, his guns dealing death with impossible accuracy. But even he could see the tide turning. The defenders were being pushed back, the carefully prepared positions falling one by one. The church, their final fallback point, loomed behind them like a last bastion of hope. "Wyatt!" Clara's voice cut through the chaos. She stood in the church doorway, her shotgun smoking. "The basement's full. We can't take any more wounded." A bullet splintered the wood beside her head, and Wyatt's return shot dropped the shooter from his horse. But for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to appear from the smoke and darkness. "Get inside," he ordered Clara. "Bar the doors, no matter what you hear, no matter what happens, hold that position." She met his eyes for a moment, understanding dawning. "What are you going to do?" Wyatt checked his ammunition. 4 rounds in one Colt, 5 in the other. Not nearly enough for what was coming. But then again, Ghost Callahan had always been good at making impossible odds work in his favor. "What I should have done at Devil's Canyon," he replied softly. "End this. Once and for all." The night was far from over, and the legend of Ghost Callahan was about to add another bloody chapter to its tale. Smoke rolled through Cedar Creek's streets like a living thing, thick and choking, shot through with sparks from the burning buildings. Wyatt moved through this hellish landscape like a wraith, his coat billowing in the hot wind. 9 rounds total. He'd have to make each one count. Behind him, the church stood as the town's last defense, its white walls now stained with soot and blood. "You're getting old, Ghost," Rattler's voice taunted from somewhere in the smoke. "Time was you'd have ended this by now." A bullet whined past Wyatt's head, embedding itself in a wooden post with a solid thunk. Wyatt didn't bother responding. Instead, he mentally mapped the street through the smoke. 20 years of gunfighting had taught him that words were just distractions. Action was what mattered. He counted at least 15 of Rattler's men still active, spread out in a rough semicircle, trying to surround him. Inside the church, he knew Montgomery was organizing the last defense. The basement sheltered the wounded and the townspeople who couldn't fight. Clara's shotgun would be covering the back entrance, while Silas and the remaining defenders watched the windows. But they were running out of ammunition and everyone knew it. A shape moved through the smoke to Wyatt's left, one of Rattler's veterans trying to flank him. The man was good, moving low and fast, but Wyatt was better. His first shot took the attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second found his gun hand as he tried to return fire. "Still counting shots, boys," Wyatt called out, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had made him legendary. "7 left. Who's feeling lucky?" A volley of gunfire answered him, bullets cutting through the space where he'd been standing, but Wyatt was already moving, flowing like water between covers. 2 more shapes emerged from the smoke, firing as they advanced. His Colt sparked twice, 5 rounds left and 2 more of Rattler's men down. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Ghost," Rattler shouted. He'd dismounted somewhere in the chaos, his voice coming from multiple directions as he moved through the smoke. "That church ain't gonna hold forever. And when it falls, everyone inside burns." A bottle crashed near Wyatt's position, spreading liquid fire across the ground. The heat was intense, forcing him to roll away from his cover. 3 more bottles followed, creating a wall of flame that cut off his retreat to the church. They were trying to box him in, force him to waste his remaining ammunition. But Wyatt had been in worse situations. Devil's Canyon had taught him that sometimes the best defense was an unexpected offense. He holstered his right-hand Colt, reaching instead for something he'd prepared earlier, a flask of lamp oil with a rag fuse, courtesy of Clara's general store. "Getting desperate, Rattler?" he called out, striking a match against his boot. "Using fire instead of lead? That ain't your style." As he spoke, he tracked the source of Rattler's voice, noting how the gang leader was moving in a pattern, trying to confuse him about his true position. "Times change, Ghost. Gotta adapt or die." Rattler's laugh had an edge of madness to it now. "Speaking of change, how's that wound I gave you at the canyon? Still wake up feeling it?" Wyatt lit the fuse but waited. Timing would be everything. "Why don't you come check for yourself?" More bottles crashed around him, the flames creating a deadly circle. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe. But Wyatt had counted the footsteps and tracked the pattern. Rattler was moving clockwise, staying just out of sight, waiting for the flames to force his old enemy into the open. A bullet clipped Wyatt's coat. Not Rattler's shot, but one of his men trying to earn glory. The return shot from Wyatt's left-hand Colt dropped him instantly, 4 rounds left. "Your men are dying, Rattler," Wyatt called out, moving carefully through the smoke. "All so you can settle an old score? Ain't just about you anymore, Ghost." Rattler's voice was closer now, just where Wyatt had predicted he'd be. "This territory's changing. Towns like this, they're dying anyway. I'm just helping them along, building something new from the ashes." Wyatt heard the crunch of boots on broken glass, 3 steps away behind the burning remains of a wagon. "Nothing new about evil, Rattler. Just wear different masks." He threw the flask high and wide, the burning fuse trailing sparks through the smoke. As expected, Rattler's attention followed the arc of the projectile. It was the oldest trick in warfare: force your enemy to look where you want them to look. Wyatt moved like lightning, diving through the narrow gap between flames. His shoulder slammed into Rattler's midsection, driving them both to the ground. The gang leader was strong, but Wyatt had surprise and momentum. They rolled across the dirt, neither able to bring their guns to bear in the close-quarters struggle. "Should have stayed dead at the canyon," Rattler snarled, trying to get his knife free. His face was a mask of hate and madness, illuminated by the surrounding fires. "You first," Wyatt replied, slamming Rattler's knife hand against the ground. The blade fell away, disappearing in the darkness. But Rattler hadn't survived this long by fighting fair. His head snapped forward, catching Wyatt in the face. The momentary distraction was enough for him to break free, rolling away toward where his men were gathering. "Burn it all!" Rattler screamed, blood streaming from his nose. "Burn everything!" A new volley of fire bottles arced toward the church, their deadly payload spreading across the white walls. The wood began to catch, smoke curling up toward the heavens. Wyatt came to his feet, both Colts drawn. 4 rounds left and a church full of innocent people about to burn. Sometimes legend has to become reality. The real question was, could Ghost Callahan make 4 bullets do the work of 40? The church was burning, its white walls turned orange by the spreading flames. Inside, Montgomery and the others worked desperately to evacuate the basement, passing children through windows while defenders held off Rattler's men. The sound of gunfire mixed with screams and the roar of the fire, creating a symphony of chaos. Wyatt stood in the street, smoke swirling around him like a living shroud. 4 bullets. The weight of the Colts in his hands felt like judgment itself. He'd been in impossible situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about redemption. "Last chance, Ghost." Rattler's voice carried over the crackling flames. He'd retreated behind his men, using them as shields, while he coordinated the attack. "Throw down your guns, walk away. I'll even let the townspeople go, most of them anyway." A bullet whizzed past Wyatt's head, followed by another. Rattler's men were getting bolder, moving forward through the smoke. They could smell victory like wolves scenting wounded prey. But they'd forgotten something crucial about wounded prey. It was often the most dangerous. "Mr. Callahan," Billy's voice cut through the chaos. The boy had somehow made it to the church's bell tower, using the height to spot enemy movements. "They're bringing more fire wagons. From the east." Wyatt's mind raced. Fire wagons meant they'd prepared for this and had supply lines set up, which meant... His eyes narrowed as he spotted movement in the shadows between buildings. They weren't just attacking from the front. "Clara!" he shouted toward the church. "Watch your back door!" His warning came just in time. The crash of Clara's shotgun echoed from behind the church, followed by cursing and the sound of retreating footsteps. She'd stopped their flanking attempt, but for how long? "Running out of tricks, Ghost," Rattler taunted. "Running out of time, too. How many rounds do you got left? 4, 3? Wyatt didn't respond. Instead, he studied the burning buildings around him, noting how the smoke moved, how the wind carried embers. Years of experience had taught him to read battlefields like books, and this one was telling him something important. The wind was changing. "Montgomery!" he called out, never taking his eyes off the threats in front of him. "Get everyone out of the church. Head for the creek." "But the church is our last." Montgomery started to protest. "Trust me." Wyatt cut him off. He could see what others couldn't yet, the way the wind was shifting, driving the smoke back toward Rattler's position. Nature itself was about to become an ally. Inside the church, Montgomery hesitated only a moment before acting. "Everyone out! Through the back! Move!" Wyatt began moving laterally, drawing fire from Rattler's men. Each shot that missed him was one less bullet they had for the evacuating townspeople. His own ammunition remained precious, 4 rounds that had to count when it mattered most. "Getting scared, Ghost?" Rattler called out. "Running away like you did at Devil's Canyon?" "Didn't run then," Wyatt replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm. "Not running now." He moved again, purposefully exposing himself for a fraction of a second. 2 more shots rang out, 2 more bullets wasted. The wind shifted more strongly now, driving thick smoke into Rattler's position. His men began coughing, their eyes watering as visibility dropped to nothing. This was what Wyatt had been waiting for. He moved like a ghost through the smoke, years of training making every step silent despite the debris-strewn street. The first of Rattler's men never saw him coming. A quick strike with the butt of his Colt, and the man dropped without a sound. The second managed to turn, but Wyatt was already past him, delivering another precise blow. "Can't see," one of the bandits shouted. "Boss, we can't." His words cut off in a grunt as Wyatt struck again. Rattler's voice carried a note of panic now. "Hold position. Don't let him—" A shot rang out, wild and desperate, nearly hitting one of his own men. 3 down without firing a shot. Wyatt moved like water through their ranks, each strike precise and devastating. These weren't killing blows. He was saving his bullets for one target. The smoke continued to thicken, turned orange by the flames that had now spread to several buildings. "Ghost!" Rattler screamed, real fear in his voice now. "Where are you, you devil?" A shape loomed out of the smoke, one of his own men stumbling backward. Rattler fired reflexively, the shot taking his loyal soldier in the chest. The dying man's scream seemed to freeze the blood of those still standing. "Getting sloppy, Rattler," Wyatt's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Shooting your own man now? What did you do at Devil's Canyon, too?" The remaining bandits were breaking, their nerves shattered by the smoke and the invisible predator in their midst. They began to run, leaving their leader alone in the choking darkness. Rattler spun in circles, his gun trembling as he tried to track movement in the smoke. "Come out and face me!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Face me like a man! Like you faced those families in the towns you burned?" Wyatt's voice was closer now. "Like you faced my men when you ambushed them?" A figure appeared in the smoke to Rattler's left. He fired, the shot passing through empty air. Another shape to his right, another shot, another miss. His gun clicked empty, the sound seeming to echo in the smoke-filled street. "2 bullets left," Wyatt's voice came from behind him. "1 more than I need." Rattler spun, raising his empty gun like a club, but he was already too late. The legend of Ghost Callahan was about to add its final chapter. Smoke swirled between them like lost souls as Wyatt and Rattler faced each other in the burning street. The gang leader's usual swagger had vanished, replaced by the desperate tension of a cornered animal. His empty gun hung uselessly at his side, while Wyatt's Colts remained steady, trained on his old enemy's heart. "You've lost, Rattler," Wyatt said quietly, his voice carrying despite the roar of the flames. "Your men are gone. Your plan failed. Time to end this." Rattler's laugh was sharp and bitter, edged with madness. "End it?" "Ghost, it never ended. Not since Devil's Canyon. Been living in my head all these years. The way you moved through our ranks that day like some kind of demon. Killed 8 of my best men before we brought you down. 9, Wyatt corrected coldly. You forgot about Jenkins, the one who tried to run? The flames cast shifting shadows across Rattler's face, highlighting the scars that years of violence had left. Always so precise, aren't you? That's what makes you dangerous. Not just quick, calculating. Every move planned, every shot counted. Around them, Cedar Creek burned. The church's steeple had become a torch against the night sky, while smaller fires consumed other buildings. But the wind that had aided Wyatt's attack was now driving the flames away from where the townspeople had retreated, giving them precious time to reach safety. "You want to know something funny, Ghost?" Rattler's hand moved slowly toward his belt, where a knife handle gleamed. "I had it all planned out. Spent months studying this town, learning its weaknesses. Even had men watching you, learning your routines. But you know what I never figured out?" "What's that?" Wyatt's aim never wavered, though his eyes tracked every subtle movement of Rattler's body. "Why here? Of all the places you could have hidden, why pick this dusty little nowhere town?" Genuine curiosity mixed with the madness in Rattler's voice. The great Ghost Callahan, playing rancher in a place most folks can't even find on a map. "Because they were good people," Wyatt replied simply. "Because they didn't deserve what men like you bring." Rattler's hand closed around the knife handle. "Good people? They're all the same, Ghost. Weak, scared, Give them enough pressure, they'll turn on each other like wolves. What do you tell yourself? To justify the burning? The killing? Wyatt's voice carried a dangerous edge now. Or is it simpler than that? You just enjoy watching things burn. The gang leader's face twisted into a snarl. At least I admit what I am. You're no different. Just wear your killing better. Dress it up in a badge and call it justice. Maybe, Wyatt acknowledged. But there's one difference between us, Rattler. I know exactly how many men I've killed. Every face. Every name. You stopped counting long ago. Rattler's knife came up in a flash of steel, but Wyatt was already moving. The first shot took Rattler in the shoulder, spinning him around. The blade clattered to the street as he stumbled backward, cursing. That's one, Wyatt said calmly, smoke wreathing around him like a cloak. Got 3 more. Want to try again? Blood streaming from his shoulder, Rattler reached for something in his boot. A derringer, small but deadly at this range. Still counting shots, Ghost? Let's see if you counted right. The tiny gun barked, the bullet cutting through Wyatt's coat. But Ghost Callahan hadn't earned his legend by being slow. His second shot knocked the derringer from Rattler's hand, taking 2 fingers with it. 2 left, Wyatt announced, advancing through the smoke. That's justice for the Watson family. Want to earn the 3rd? Rattler backed away, clutching his mangled hand. His eyes darted around wildly, looking for escape, for weapons, for anything to turn the tide. You can't kill me, Ghost. I'm in your head just like you're in mine. We're 2 sides of the same coin. No, Wyatt replied, his voice cold as mountain snow. We're not, because I remember Devil's Canyon. Remember what you did to those surrendering men? My men. Something changed in Rattler's face then. A kind of acceptance mixed with his madness. They begged, you know. Every one of them. Begged like children while we... Wyatt's 3rd shot took him in the leg, dropping him to the burning street. That's for them. 1 bullet left, Rattler. Make your peace. Through the pain and the spreading pool of blood, Rattler managed one last twisted smile. Peace? There's no peace for men like us, Ghost. We're already burning in hell. I'm just bringing it to earth. His hand came up one final time, something gleaming in his palm. A stick of dynamite, its fuse already sparking. Must have had it hidden the whole time, waiting for this moment. See you in hell, Ghost. The 4th shot rang out just as Rattler's arm went back to throw. The dynamite fell from lifeless fingers, rolling harmlessly into a puddle as the gang leader toppled backward, a neat hole in the center of his forehead. His eyes stared sightlessly at the burning sky, that final mad smile still etched on his face. Wyatt stood over him, smoke and embers swirling around his tall form. Empty guns still in hand, he spoke softly to his fallen enemy. Hell's too crowded with your kind already. I'll take my chances elsewhere. In the distance, voices called out. Montgomery and the others, making sure the town was secure. The fire wagons Rattler's men had abandoned were being turned against the flames, saving what could be saved from Cedar Creek. Dawn wasn't far off, and with it would come the reckoning of what had been lost and what had been preserved. But for now, Ghost Callahan stood in the burning street, finally free of the shadows that had haunted him since Devil's Canyon. 4 bullets had been enough after all. Enough for justice. Enough for vengeance. Enough for peace. The legend could rest at last. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek like a gentle apology, its soft light revealing the full extent of the night's violence. The street where Wyatt had faced down Rattler was a scarred battlefield. Bullet holes poked the buildings, and the acrid smell of gun smoke still hung in the air despite the morning breeze. The church's blackened walls stood like silent sentinels, though the fire crews had managed to save most of the structure. Wyatt stood in the middle of it all, his empty Colts now holstered, watching as the townspeople emerged from their refuge by the creek. They moved through the wreckage with a mix of shock and determination, already beginning the work of rebuilding. Clara led them, organizing teams to salvage what could be saved and clear what couldn't. Found these in the street, Montgomery said, approaching with a handful of spent cartridges. 4 shots, just like you said. Never seen shooting like that, not in all my years wearing a badge. Wyatt didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on Rattler's body, still lying where it had fallen. In death, the gang leader looked smaller somehow, the fearsome reputation stripped away to reveal just another man who'd chosen the wrong path. We'll need to bury them properly, Wyatt finally said. Even him. Town needs closure, not more ghosts. Clara approached, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and determined. Already got Silas and some of the men digging plots in the cemetery. Far corner, away from decent folks. She paused, studying Wyatt's expression. Unless you think that's too good for them? Dead is dead, Wyatt replied softly. Ground doesn't care what kind of man it covers. The morning activity increased as more townspeople returned, each finding ways to help. Billy Reeves organized the younger boys into search parties, looking for anything worth salvaging in the wreckage. Doc Sullivan had set up a temporary clinic on the church steps, tending to the wounded with quiet efficiency. Final count, Montgomery reported, consulting a paper in his hand. We lost 4 of our own. Tom Wilson, Pete Masters, and the Cooper brothers, 8 more wounded, but Doc says they'll pull through. Could have been a lot worse. Wyatt nodded grimly. Every death weighed on him, added to the tally he'd carried since Devil's Canyon. But he knew the truth, and without preparation, without training, the town would have been completely destroyed. Rattler's men, he asked. 17 dead, including him. Rest scattered to the wind. Found their camp about 3 miles out. They'd stockpiled enough weapons and supplies to raid 10 towns. Montgomery's voice carried a mix of disgust and relief. Won't be needing any of it now. Clara had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. The real question is what happens next. Those that ran, they might come back, or others like them. Wyatt turned to face the rising sun, its light catching the silver threads in his dark hair. The years of hiding, of trying to leave his past behind, felt like a dream now. Ghost Callahan had risen again, not as a legend of vengeance, but as a protector. They might, he acknowledged, but they'll find more than just a quiet rancher waiting for them. The sound of hammering began to echo through the street as Silas and his crew started repairs on the damaged buildings. The steady rhythm spoke of resilience, of a community that refused to be broken. Women began setting up a makeshift kitchen to feed the workers, while children carried water and messages between groups. "You're staying, then?" Clara asked, though it wasn't really a question. There was something different in her voice now, a warmth that spoke of more than just respect. "Got a ranch to run," Wyatt replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Besides, somebody needs to keep teaching Billy how to shoot straight." Montgomery chuckled, then winced at the pain from his wounds. "Speaking of teaching, those defensive positions you showed us might be worth making them permanent. Town could use a proper wall, maybe some watchtowers." Turning Cedar Creek into a fortress? Clara raised an eyebrow. "No," Wyatt said thoughtfully. "Turning it into a symbol. Place where good people can stand together, protect what's theirs." He gestured to where the townspeople worked together, helping each other without being asked. "That's worth defending." A rider appeared at the edge of town, one of the outlying ranchers coming to check on the commotion. More would follow as word spread, bringing help and supplies. Cedar Creek wouldn't stand alone. "Ghost Callahan," Montgomery mused, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd live to see the legend in action. Stories didn't do you justice." "Ghost Callahan died at Devil's Canyon," Wyatt replied firmly. "Man who came back is just Wyatt. Rancher, neighbor, whatever the town needs." Clara's hand found his, squeezing gently. "And if the town needs a protector?" Wyatt's other hand rested on his empty holster, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. But this time it felt right, like a burden shared rather than a cross to bear alone. "Then they'll have one," he said simply. "But not a ghost. Something better." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of smoke. Cedar Creek was wounded but unbowed, its spirit stronger for having faced the fire. And in its streets, a legend had found something he'd thought lost forever at Devil's Canyon. Not just purpose, but home. The quiet rancher would remain quiet no longer, but his guns would speak only when justice demanded. The ghost had found peace at last, in the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for, and some places were worth calling home. 1 week after Rattler's fall, Cedar Creek was beginning to rise from its ashes. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air from dawn to dusk as buildings were repaired and reinforced. The church's damaged steeple had been rebuilt, its new bell tower standing taller than before, now doubling as a watchtower. Silas Fletcher had turned his blacksmith shop into a makeshift armory, crafting not just horseshoes but steel plates to reinforce doors and windows. Wyatt stood on the porch of Clara's general store, watching as a wagon train of supplies rolled into town. Word of Cedar Creek's stand against Rattler's gang had spread throughout the territory, and with it came unexpected support. Ranchers, traders, and even a few lawmen had arrived, bringing materials, ammunition, and willing hands. "Territory Marshal sent word," Montgomery said, joining Wyatt with a cup of coffee in hand. His wounds were healing well, though he still favored his left side. With Rattler gone, 3 other gangs have pulled back from the border. Seems no one wants to test whether there are more like you out there. "There's something better out there," Wyatt replied, nodding toward where Billy Reeves was teaching younger children how to spot approaching riders. People willing to stand together, protect what's theirs. The town had changed in more ways than just the physical. People walked differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from facing fear and emerging stronger. The militia Wyatt had trained continued their practice, with Montgomery incorporating their defensive strategies into daily life. Even Clara had organized the women into recovery teams, ensuring the town would never be caught unprepared again. "Got something to show you," Montgomery said, leading Wyatt toward the newly reinforced jail. Inside, on the sheriff's desk, lay a silver star. "Territory's offering to make Cedar Creek a proper marshal station. Says we need someone with experience keeping the peace out here." Wyatt looked at the badge, memories of Devil's Canyon flickering through his mind. But these memories no longer carried the same weight of guilt and regret. "Already got a good sheriff," he said quietly. Montgomery chuckled. "Town's growing. Marshal says we could use both. A sheriff for daily peace, and a marshal for bigger threats." He pushed the badge forward. "Folks here trust you, Wyatt, not because of the legend, but because of what you showed them they could be." Before Wyatt could respond, Clara entered with Ruth Coleman close behind. "Riders spotted to the south," Ruth reported, "but friendly this time. Looks like the Watson family returning, and they've brought help." Through the window, they could see a dust cloud approaching. Wagons and riders, nearly 20 strong. Old Man Watson had spread the word during his recovery, reaching out to other families who'd been driven from their homes by bandits. Now they were coming to Cedar Creek, drawn by the promise of a place that would stand and fight. "Town's changing," Clara observed, moving to stand beside Wyatt. "Growing stronger. People are calling it a sanctuary now, somewhere honest folks can find protection." Wyatt studied the badge on the desk, its silver surface catching the morning light. "Sanctuary needs guardians," he said thoughtfully. "And guidelines," Montgomery added. "Marshal says we'd have authority to set up proper laws, train deputies and coordinate with other towns. Build something lasting." Outside, the Watson party was rolling into town. Among them were faces Wyatt recognized, families he'd helped years ago when he still wore a badge. They'd heard Ghost Callahan had resurfaced and had come to offer their support, but more importantly, they'd come to be part of something bigger than themselves. "Think about it," Clara said softly, her hand finding his. "You don't have to be a ghost anymore. Could be something new, something that builds instead of haunts." Wyatt stepped out onto the street, watching as the newcomers were welcomed by the townspeople. Billy Reeves was already organizing the younger men to help unload wagons, while Doc Sullivan checked on those who needed medical attention. The scene spoke of community, of people coming together not just to survive, but to thrive. "Got room for all of them?" he asked Montgomery, who had followed him outside. "Got plans for expansion," the sheriff replied. "Silas drew up designs for new buildings stronger this time. Figure we can turn Cedar Creek into something special, a place where the law means something again." Wyatt's hand moved to his gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of his Colts. But they didn't feel like instruments of vengeance anymore. Now they represented something else: protection, justice, the shield rather than the sword. "Rattler was right about one thing," he said, watching as children played in the street, unafraid of shadows. "Territory is changing. Question is, what's it changing into?" Clara stepped up beside him, her presence a reminder of everything worth protecting. "That's up to us, isn't it? To make sure it changes for the better?" Wyatt picked up the marshal's badge, its weight familiar yet different. Ghost Callahan had been a legend of vengeance, born in blood at Devil's Canyon. But perhaps it was time for a new legend, one of protection, of justice tempered by mercy, of a town that refused to fall. "Better get to work then," he said, pinning the badge to his vest. "Got a lot of building to do." The morning sun caught the silver star, making it shine like a beacon of hope. Cedar Creek was more than just a town now. It was a symbol of what people could accomplish when they stood together. And its guardian was no longer a ghost, but a man who had found his true purpose. The legend had evolved, and with it a new chapter in the story of the West had begun. 3 months after Rattler's defeat, Cedar Creek had become almost unrecognizable. New buildings stood proud along the widened Main Street, their walls reinforced with Silas Fletcher's steel plates. The church spire rose higher than ever, its bell tower now topped with a proper watch post where young scouts kept vigilant eyes on the horizon. But the biggest changes weren't in the buildings. They were in the people. On this particular morning, Wyatt Callahan stood outside the newly constructed marshal's office, watching as Billy Reeves led shooting practice with a group of newcomers. The young man who had once been just a stable boy now carried himself with quiet confidence, his skills with a rifle nearly matching his mentor's. The silver marshal's badge on Wyatt's vest caught the morning sun as he made minor corrections to the shooter's stances. "Getting better every day," Montgomery observed, joining Wyatt on the porch. The sheriff's wounds had healed clean, leaving only scars to remind them of that fateful night. 3 more families arrived yesterday. Word spreading about Cedar Creek. Word spreading about more than that, Clara added, approaching with the morning mail. She handed Wyatt a newspaper from back east. "They're calling it the Sanctuary of the West now. Place where good people can find protection, build a life without fear." Wyatt scanned the article, noting how the writer had romanticized the battle against Rattler's gang. The legend of Ghost Callahan had evolved, transformed from a tale of vengeance into one of protection and justice. But the truth was far simpler and far more important. "Got something else to show you," Montgomery said, leading them inside the marshal's office. On the wall hung a detailed map of the territory, with Cedar Creek at its center. Small flags marked the locations of other towns and settlements. Territory governors making it official. We're to be the hub for a new peacekeeping network, training, coordination, support for smaller towns. Building something bigger than ourselves, Wyatt mused, studying the map. He thought of all the places he'd tried to help in his Ghost Callahan days, how temporary those victories had seemed. This was different. This was a lasting change. The sound of horses drew their attention outside, where a group of riders was approaching. Among them was Doc Sullivan, returning from his circuit of nearby ranches. The physician had expanded his practice, training others in basic medical care and establishing a network of healers throughout the region. "Brought back some news," Doc announced as he dismounted. "Caught wind of some of Rattler's old gang trying to regroup near the border. But here's the interesting part. 3 other towns drove them off before they could cause trouble. Used our defensive strategies, worked together just like we planned." Clara smiled at this, her hand finding Wyatt's. "See? The ripples spread, just like you said they would." The morning continued with its usual activities. but there was nothing routine about it. Every practice session, every patrol, every new arrival reinforced what Cedar Creek had become, a beacon of hope in a harsh land. The town's population had nearly doubled, with every newcomer bringing skills and determination to contribute to the community. Wyatt walked the street, noting the changes large and small. Silas's shop had expanded into a proper metalworks, producing not just weapons but tools for building and farming. The general store, now run jointly by Clara and Ruth Coleman, had become a hub for trading information as well as goods. Even the saloon had transformed, becoming more of a gathering place for planning and coordination than drinking and gambling. At the edge of town, near where he had faced down Rattler in that final confrontation, a small memorial had been erected. It honored not just those who had fallen defending Cedar Creek, but all who had suffered under the reign of men like Rattler. It stood as a reminder of why they fought, why they built, why they endured. "Still think about that night?" Clara asked softly, joining him at the memorial. "Sometimes," Wyatt admitted, "but not like before, not with regret." She nodded, understanding. "Because now you're building something instead of just fighting." "We all are," he corrected, watching as Billy led his students through their final drills of the morning. "Every person here, whether they can shoot straight or not, they're part of it." The sound of the church bell rang out, not in warning this time, but calling people to the town meeting that had become a weekly tradition. Plans would be made, problems solved, progress celebrated. This was how legends truly lived on, not through violence, but through the communities they helped build. As they walked toward the church, Wyatt caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window. The quiet rancher was still there, but so was the marshal, the protector, the builder. Ghost Callahan had found something better than vengeance. He'd found purpose, home, and hope. "Ready to help write the next chapter?" Clara asked, seeing his thoughtful expression. Wyatt smiled, touching the badge that represented not his past but his future. "Already writing it," he replied. "All of us. Together." The morning sun cast their shadows long across Cedar Creek Street, but these shadows didn't haunt or threaten. They pointed forward, toward a future where legends weren't born from violence, but from the courage to stand together and build something lasting. The ghost had found peace, and in doing so, had helped others find their strength. And that perhaps was the greatest legend of all. If you enjoyed this story of courage, redemption, and the power of standing together, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more tales of hope and justice to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.